Welcome to PodAud series of Indian podcasting revolution, where your hosts Roshni and Rohit audit, review, and give a shout out to some noteworthy Indian podcasts.
In this podcast audit, we do not critique the shows, but applaud the efforts of the independent podcasters and suggest improvements.
And not only that, this also gives an opportunity to podcast listeners find great shows to binge on. So listen on and let's jump into today's PodAud. So today's PodAud is reviewing a very different kind of a genre. We, being the production company at Done For You podcast, are always entangled with business, marketing, and all those kind of genres. But this time we are reviewing a podcast which is all about love, life, relationship, and all the quizzes and the googlies it throws at us. And it is a beautiful podcast named Happily Whatever After, hosted by Karan and Shokhi Banerjee. And these are a couple who are talking about how they found each other, how they found love with each other. And yet they also discovered that what love is not about. Actually, it is not all about the Bollywood saga. And that actually is a reality, right? And the beautiful part about this podcast is that although it talks about a very personal experience of two people, of how their relationship grew, how they nurtured it, but effectively it is about sending out the listeners a message about how they should view love in their life, how they should handle relationships, how they should approach the complexities of relationships in their life. And that's the concept, and the beautiful thing about this podcast is that although the narration is very cute couple talk kind of a thing happening, but it is ultimately curated, keeping the listener in the mind, with the perspective of that the listener can get some takeaway, some answers for the complexities they are facing in their personal space. So that's my observation of this particular podcast. And I would love to bring in Rohit and tell him or ask him to share what is his observation about this show.
How interesting this show is, na Roshni? Happily whatever after. So you just have to live whatever happens afterwards, but you don't have to stress more about it, because then the kind of relationship we have with the people, it's most exciting part of our life. And the kind of conversation these people are having onto this particular podcast, Happily Whatever After, is something to really look after, because then you don't get often listen to such kind of shows where people are talking to each other and they're narrating their own stories, their incidents. So it creates a safe space for the people who are looking for such kind of episodes, because when it is about relationships, when it is about love, when it is about anything that revolves around this particular term, we all need people to talk about. So be it family, friends, or relatives, but at times we are clueless like to whom to reach out. And this is the kind of a podcast which will offer great insights on to the various aspects of our relationship, because then most of the people struggle with many elements of it. And right now it is getting quite dynamic, because then the kind of relationships we are sharing with the people, be it digital, be it into the personal life, which could be in existence as of now. So the format, the planning that they have done through this kind of a podcast is absolutely top notch, because then they're not following the usual format of question and answer. It is more of the incident based, because then it gives you a lot of space to talk about that particular topic. So that is something, it excites me. And when we are talking about the relevance, so people love to listen to this real life stories, because then if you're talking about some other genre, be it leadership or something like marketing, it has a kind of a fixed wavelength to it. It has a kind of a fixed mindset to it. Like these are the theories, these are the practical implications of it. But when it is about relationship, each and every individual will be having a different kind of a experience. So it becomes that exciting. And that is the reason we have seen vlogs performing great onto the YouTube. And in such way, this show can again, like as it is topping the charts, we know how people are consuming this kind of a show. Like, so this is something that I loved most about it. And if we talk about the duration of the episode, that has been really done well. But I feel that they could just add more of like bite-sized episodes as well, which will give quick overview of few of the elements of the relationship as a topic. Otherwise, it's a binge on podcast. Like you can just go play, hit the play button, and then binge on to this particular podcast. What else you have?
Yeah, I think the casual conversation between Karan and Shokhi are so effortless that you kind of roll with it. You never are able to identify when to hit a pause or a stop when you are hearing the conversation. You actually become a part of that entire narration and story they are having. And I won't call it storytelling as well, it is experience sharing. It is in a very dramatic way. And they are bringing their personality through, and that is very very essential for any podcast host to do on their show, is to bring across their own personality, their quirks, the way they speak, the language they speak. Because many a times it happens that in order to sound better, people try to not be themselves, and that's when they start sounding more robotic. But I love the fact that Karan and Shokhi are truly bringing out their personalities, and that's what I think hooks the listeners as well to their show. Because right now they don't have number, like quite a number of episodes. I think it's just 13 or 14 episodes they have at the time we are recording this episode. So 13, 14 episodes is not that long a list, but they do have like 20, 22 star ratings on Spotify, and every episode has kind of 2 to 3 replies, which actually is an indication of how engaged the listeners are. And the audience gets engaged with your podcast or the episode when they are hooked to the personality you are bringing through to the show. And that's what I think both the hosts, Karan and Shoki, have been able to do remarkably well. That's my observation. What about you?
Absolutely, because you did talk about the audience engagement, Roshni. And as I said, that they are topping the charts, they are getting the replies as well onto the questions they are floating over the podcast. So it becomes evident that people, like, it's not, we live with a common notion that if you are a couple, then you have to share more of your stories on Instagram or something like that. They do have the profile out there. But making people to listen to that particular podcast and then coming to engage onto your profile is something that is happening through a podcast. So whatever the audience they are growing for their kind of a show, it is coming from the podcast and to the then connecting with the IG stories or something like that. So it is more the impact of the podcast that they have created, and it just gives out the clear message that podcasting is the right medium if you have to share your personal stories or the experiences. So that is what I have noticed. And one thing, like when they're having the conversation, if someone wants to speak or override that particular conversation, they just give a great amount of space. Like they're not just pulling each other back. So that is something I noticed, that you get a safe space to interrupt that particular conversation, put their individual point, and then again carry that conversation. So that is happening. And I noticed that if we talk about their social media presence, they are quite active on Instagram. But if they are just wanting to spread onto the other channels as well through their podcast, I feel that people will be able to relate more with their kind of a work they are doing or whatever they are into their professional life as well. Because personal life to share की जा रही है, but what about like who are these people onto the professional front as well? So a platform like LinkedIn, they are having their individual profiles, but again, like sharing their stories or the episode snippets onto the LinkedIn or other areas like Twitter would garner more of the reach, because each and every platform has got its own kind of a way of hooking the audience. So if you are talking about engaging audience, then having the presence on other social media platform will also help them to grow their own podcast. And if you're talking about the work, about the packaging, I feel that there is a more scope that can be happening in a better way. Packaging is something that they can focus, but it's more of like being the casual conversation, being the wholehearted conversation that they are doing. They will be feeling that they are comfortable with it, but more about like what is the backdrop of that particular story or episode they are talking about can be done through the intro and then starting with the episode. The call to action and all are fantastic, is what I would say. But yeah, there remains the scope of improvement as well. So these are all my observations apart from the podcast.
But I think the raw nature, the unscripted and non structured format of the podcast actually suits very well with the kind of content they are bringing across. Because it is authentic and experiential narration they are bringing. I don't think the way we do intros and outros and hooks for a business podcast, that is actually needed in this kind of a format. And I think this format suits very well in the kind of narration they are doing. They have, of course, dedicated the very first episode introducing themselves, who they are, where they come from, the professional space as well. But yeah, I like this might be a personal opinion as well, but yeah, I like the way they are bringing the raw format of the real life. The idea is to put out their real life, the nuances and the behind the scenes of it, right? So it is about putting it out in a very raw format, and that's why I think the production quality also is not very like high or impeccable kind of a thing. But that's what the essence and the theme of this podcast is. And that's why I think, even if the production quality is not very high, I think it is doing a justice to the entire concept of the podcast. Strategically, however, I think they have done a commendable job with the show notes. So what they've done is that they always include questions and prompts to the listener, as to making it relatable to the listener. So they are asking the listener, how do you feel when someone says no to you, or no to your proposal? How do you feel when your girlfriend says that I don't love you? So that's the kind of thing which makes it a very personal experience, right? And that's what is hooks the listeners to the episode and the podcast. So I think those are some good golden and stars to the podcast. But yes, of course, like you said, there's always scope of improvement, and that's what the genre of the podcast medium itself gives the opportunity for, which is experimenting. So yeah, that's there. So with that, let's jump into listening to the trailer of Happily Whatever After.
Welcome to Happily Whatever After podcast. We are your host couple Karan
and Shokhi.
and we are here to share our untold love story, our journey of coming together and breaking apart in love, life and other accidents.
We are your couple next door, navigating day-to-day life with groceries, laundry, cooking, budgets, and at the same time dealing with the difficult conversations in a relationship, like expectations from your partner, family issues, financial issues, and yet somehow we manage to come together in love every single day.
No one told us it's not going to be happily ever after. So here we are telling you, you are not alone in this. If you are in a relationship, married or not, welcome. This podcast is for you.
This is not happily ever after. This is our
Happily whatever after.
We hope you will like the podcast we have reviewed on today's PodAud, and will head over to it to give it a listen. By the way, if you want your podcast to be audited by us, just fill the application form link in the show notes.
And yes, thank you so much for being here today. Do send us DM on Instagram at TFY Podcast if you follow Indian Podcasting Revolution. And if you are yet to follow, what are you waiting for? Follow it now and join us next week for yet another episode. These are your hosts, Roshni and Rohit, signing off.